Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
My name is Luther Blackwood, 27 years old from Boston. 3 months ago, my beloved grandfather Thomas passed away, leaving me his entire fortune. Little did I know that my estranged father Adam, who abandoned us when I was 5, would suddenly reappear demanding everything. In that courtroom, as my father pointed at me in front of his friend the judge and called me undeserving, I felt my blood turn cold. What happened next changed everything. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground against family who only showed up when money was involved. Growing up, my earliest memories were filled with the warm presence of my grandfather, Thomas Blackwood. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. While other kids had their dads teaching them to ride bikes or throw baseballs, I had my grandfather. That was because my father, Adam Reeves, walked out on my mother Jessica and me when I was just 5 years old. The divorce was quick and painful. My father simply decided one day that family life wasn't for him. He packed his bags and disappeared from our lives with barely a goodbye. My mother, who worked as a nurse at Boston General, suddenly found herself struggling to make ends meet while raising me alone. The child support checks were inconsistent at first, then stopped completely after a year. That's when Grandpa Thomas stepped in. He didn't just provide financial help, he became the father figure I desperately needed. Every weekend, I'd stay at his comfortable colonial house in the suburbs. He taught me how to fix things around the house, the value of hard work, and the importance of keeping your word. "A man is only as good as his word, Luther," he would say, his voice firm but kind. Meanwhile, my father was busy building a new life. Within 8 months of leaving us, he married Stephanie Carter, a woman from a wealthy family. They soon had 2 children, my half-siblings whom I barely knew. Several times during elementary school, I tried reaching out to my father. I'd call his new home, hoping for just a few minutes of his time. Each attempt was met with brief, uncomfortable conversations that always ended with him being too busy to see me. As the years passed, the contrast between my grandfather's constant presence and my father's absence became more pronounced. Grandpa Thomas never missed a single baseball game or school play. He sat in the front row at my high school graduation, tears of pride in his eyes. My father sent a generic card with a $50 bill tucked inside. Thomas Blackwood wasn't just successful in family life. He had built Blackwood Construction from the ground up. Starting with just a pickup truck and a few tools in the 70s, he had grown it into one of the most respected commercial construction companies in Massachusetts. He often took me to job sites during the summer breaks, showing me every aspect of the business. "Pay attention, Luther," he'd say. "Someday all this might be yours to look after." When I turned 22, my mother was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. Without hesitation, I put my college education on hold to care for her. It was one of the hardest periods of my life, watching her grow weaker despite the treatments. During those dark days, grandfather was our rock. He covered the medical bills that insurance wouldn't pay and sat with me during the long nights at the hospital. "You're showing real character, son," he told me one evening as we shared a quiet moment in the hospital cafeteria. "Taking care of family is what matters most in this life." My mother fought bravely for 14 months before passing away. The funeral was small but filled with the people who truly loved her. My father didn't attend, sending a generic sympathy card instead. I remember standing by her grave, my grandfather's strong hand on my shoulder, feeling utterly lost. The following months were a blur of grief. I struggled to find purpose again. It was my grandfather who eventually pulled me out of that darkness. "Jessica wouldn't want you drowning in sorrow," he said firmly. "She'd want you to live a life that would make her proud." With his encouragement and a small loan from him, I started my own business, a home renovation company specializing in historic properties. Grandfather shared his knowledge freely, introduced me to his industry contacts, and celebrated each small success with me. The business grew steadily over the next 3 years. Nothing compared to Blackwood Construction, but it was mine, built with my own 2 hands. Throughout all this, my father remained a ghost in my life, appearing occasionally on social media or through rare updates from distant relatives. I had long since stopped expecting anything from him. My grandfather had shown me what real fatherhood looked like, and Adam Reeves wasn't even a pale imitation. Last year, grandfather's health began to decline. At 84, his body finally started showing the wear of decades in construction work. First came the arthritis that made his hands curl like claws on bad days. Then the heart problems that left him short of breath. Despite his protests, I began visiting him daily, making sure he took his medications and ate properly. "I don't need babysitting," he'd grumble, even as he smiled appreciatively when I brought his favorite roast beef sandwich from the deli down the street. In those final months, we spent hours talking about everything: his childhood during the Depression, his service in Korea, how he met my grandmother, and his hopes for the future of Blackwood construction. Sometimes he'd drift into stories I'd heard dozens of times, but I never interrupted. Each telling felt precious, like something I needed to memorize. "The company is more than just buildings and profit margins," he told me one evening as we sat on his porch watching the sunset. "It's about the families of every person who works for us. It's about integrity in an industry that doesn't always value it. Remember that, Luther." 3 months ago, on a quiet Tuesday morning, I arrived at his house to find him still in bed, looking peaceful but unresponsive. The paramedics confirmed what I already knew: he had passed away in his sleep. Even through my grief, I felt grateful that he hadn't suffered. The funeral was held at the same church where we'd said goodbye to my mother. The place was packed with employees from Blackwood Construction, clients who had become friends over the years, and what seemed like half the contractors in Boston. Grandfather had been respected, even loved, by many. I was standing in the receiving line accepting condolences when I spotted a face I barely recognized. My father, Adam Reeves, had shown up unexpectedly. He looked older, of course, but still had the same calculating eyes I remembered from childhood. He approached me with a solemn expression that didn't quite reach those eyes. "Luther," he said, extending his hand, "I'm sorry for your loss." The formality of his tone made it sound like he was addressing a business acquaintance rather than his own son. I shook his hand briefly, mumbling a thank you, too numb with grief to process his sudden appearance after years of absence. Throughout the service, I noticed him studying the crowd, noting the expensive suits of my grandfather's business associates, the size of the gathering. Not once did I see him shed a tear for the man who had been a father to his abandoned son. A week later, we gathered at my grandfather's attorney's office for the reading of the will. Jackson Williams had been my grandfather's lawyer and friend for over 30 years. His office was lined with law books and framed photographs of fishing trips they had taken together. "Thomas was very specific about his wishes," Williams explained, adjusting his reading glasses. "The will has been updated several times over the years, most recently 6 months ago." I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, still processing my loss. Across the polished conference table sat my father, who had somehow learned about the reading and invited himself along. His presence made the room feel smaller, tenser. Williams began reading the formal legal language, and then came to the heart of the matter. "To my grandson, Luther Thomas Blackwood, who has shown the character, compassion, and integrity that I value most, I leave my entire estate, including my residence, personal effects, financial assets totaling approximately $4,200,000, and full ownership of Blackwood Construction Company." The silence in the room felt electric. I stared at Williams, sure I had misheard. "Everything?" I asked quietly. Williams nodded, then continued. "It is my sincere hope that Luther will continue the legacy of Blackwood Construction, maintaining the standards of quality and integrity upon which I built the company, and caring for the employees who have been like family to me." I glanced across at my father, whose face had hardened into a mask of barely contained fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests of his chair. After the reading concluded, as we gathered our things to leave, my father cornered me in the hallway outside Williams' office. "This isn't right," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I'm his son, not you." "You haven't been his son in any way that matters for decades," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll contest the will," he threatened. "Thomas wasn't in his right mind. You took advantage of an old man." "Grandfather knew exactly what he was doing," I said. "He always did." In the following days, I tried to process both my grief and the enormous responsibility that had been placed on my shoulders. I knew nothing about running a company the size of Blackwood Construction, with its dozens of employees and multiple ongoing projects. The financial inheritance alone was overwhelming. Hoping to avoid a lengthy legal battle that would only tarnish my grandfather's memory, I reached out to my father with an olive branch. I invited him to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. To my surprise, he agreed. "I'm willing to share a portion of the inheritance," I told him once we were seated with our coffees. "Not because I think you deserve it, but because I believe grandfather would want peace in the family." I slid a paper across the table outlining a generous offer, $500,000, no strings attached. It was a significant amount that would solve most financial problems, while still respecting my grandfather's wishes that I maintain control of the company. My father glanced at the paper, then laughed coldly. "You think you can buy me off with scraps? The entire estate is rightfully mine. I was his son, a son who hadn't spoken to him in years," I reminded him. "That's not relevant," he snapped. "Blood is what matters in the eyes of the law. I want everything, the money, the company, all of it." "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. As he stood to leave, he fixed me with a cold stare. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Luther. I always get what I want in the end." After that disastrous meeting, I consulted with Jackson Williams about my legal position. The elderly attorney reassured me that the will was ironclad. Thomas anticipated this reaction, Williams explained. He kept meticulous records of every interaction with Adam over the years, or lack thereof. He also underwent a complete cognitive assessment 6 months ago when he updated the will, specifically to prevent any claims of diminished capacity. During our conversation, Williams hesitated, then shared something that explained my father's sudden, intense interest in the inheritance. "Your father has been in financial trouble for some time. From what Thomas told me, Adam approached him multiple times over the years asking for large sums of money. Gambling debts, failed investments, living beyond his means, it all caught up with him. And grandfather refused to bail him out, I guessed." Williams nodded. Thomas believed in consequences. He wouldn't enable behavior that would only lead to more problems down the road. This new information filled in pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. My father's desperation suddenly made more sense. He wasn't just angry about being excluded from the will. He had been counting on that money to solve his financial problems. Walking out of Williams' office, I felt a renewed determination to honor my grandfather's wishes. If he had deliberately chosen not to give my father money during his lifetime, I would respect that decision after his death. 2 weeks after our coffee shop confrontation, I received an official legal notice. My father was contesting the will on grounds of undue influence, and my grandfather's supposed lack of testamentary capacity. The document contained accusations that made my stomach turn, claims that I had manipulated my elderly grandfather, isolated him from family, and coerced him into changing his will. The final paragraph stated that a hearing had been scheduled before Judge Franklin Harris of the probate court. The name was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. I called Williams immediately, my hands shaking with anger as I read portions of the document to him. "This is standard procedure in contested wills," he assured me, though I could hear concern in his voice. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. We'll file our response and begin preparing for the hearing." In the days that followed, Williams and I gathered evidence of my relationship with my grandfather, photographs spanning decades, birthday cards he had sent me, testimony from his employees about how he had groomed me to eventually take over the business. We collected statements from his doctors confirming his sound mental state until the very end. As we worked, Williams became increasingly troubled about the judge assigned to our case. "Franklin Harris," he muttered one afternoon, flipping through his notes. "Your father requested him specifically, which is unusual." A quick background check revealed why. Judge Harris and my father had attended the same college, belonged to the same country club, and my father had made significant contributions to Harris's judicial campaign. They weren't just acquaintances, they were friends. "Can we request a different judge?" I asked. Williams sighed. "We can try, but without concrete evidence of bias, it's unlikely to be granted. Harris has been careful to maintain the appearance of propriety in previous cases. Our first court appearance confirmed my worst fears. Judge Harris, a portly man with thinning gray hair and heavy-lidded eyes, barely glanced at the evidence we presented. He repeatedly sustained objections from my father's attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Richard Donovan, while overruling Williams' objections on flimsy grounds. The bias was subtle but unmistakable. When my father spoke, Harris leaned forward attentively. When I or Williams addressed the court, he seemed distracted, shuffling papers or checking his watch. As we left the courthouse after that first hearing, I felt a growing sense of dread. He's going to rule against us, isn't he? Williams didn't immediately deny it, which told me everything. The system isn't perfect, Luther, but we have truth on our side, and sometimes that's enough. His words were meant to be encouraging, but all I could see was my father's smug expression as he'd exited the courtroom, confident that his friendship with the judge would secure him the victory and fortune he felt entitled to. That evening, I sat alone in my grandfather's study, now legally mine, though it still felt like his space. Photos of us together lined the shelves, along with books on construction, business management, and his beloved historical biographies. I picked up a frame containing a photo from my college graduation, the ceremony I'd returned to complete after my mother's death. My grandfather stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming. "I won't let him take what you built," I promised the empty room, "or tarnish your legacy." The next few weeks brought a series of preliminary hearings, each more disheartening than the last. Judge Harris allowed my father's attorney to present character witnesses who painted me as opportunistic and manipulative, while limiting testimony from my grandfather's longtime employees and friends. My father's new wife, Stephanie, took the stand, describing rare family gatherings where I had allegedly monopolized my grandfather's attention. It was like he had cast a spell over Thomas, she claimed, dabbing at non-existent tears. Adam tried so many times to reconnect with his father, but Luther always interfered. I sat at the defendant's table, biting my tongue as lie after lie was presented as fact. Williams did his best to challenge these narratives during cross-examination, but Judge Harris frequently interrupted, claiming his questions were badgering the witness or irrelevant to the matter at hand. Outside the courtroom, my life was unraveling. My small renovation business was suffering from neglect as I focused on the legal battle. Clients were calling with complaints about delayed projects. My savings were dwindling as legal fees mounted. I couldn't access my inheritance until the case was resolved, and Blackwood Construction was in limbo, with longtime employees calling daily for updates and reassurance. Williams suggested we investigate the relationship between my father and Judge Harris more thoroughly. There might be something there that crosses the line from friendship into judicial misconduct, he explained. We hired a private investigator who uncovered more than we expected. Not only were they golf buddies and members of the same social clubs, but they had business connections as well. My father had invested in real estate developments where Harris had financial interests, and Harris's son had been given a cushy job at a company owned by my father's father-in-law. "This is a clear conflict of interest," Williams said, reviewing the investigator's report. "We can file a motion for Harris to recuse himself." "Will it work?" I asked. Williams looked grim. "Honestly, probably not. Judges have broad discretion in deciding whether to recuse themselves, and if we lose the motion, we've just antagonized the person deciding our case." As we were weighing our options, an unexpected ally emerged. Patricia Donaldson, my grandfather's executive assistant for over 15 years, contacted Williams requesting a meeting. We arranged to meet her at a small restaurant away from downtown, where she was unlikely to be recognized by anyone connected to the case. Patricia was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and alert eyes behind fashionable glasses. She had always been fiercely loyal to my grandfather, managing his schedule with military precision. "I've been following the case," she said once we were seated. "The things they're saying about you and about Thomas, they're not right." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by her support, "but I'm not sure what we can do about it." "I have information," she replied, lowering her voice. "Your father came to the office many times over the years, always when he needed money. Thomas kept records of every visit, every request. He told me things he probably didn't tell anyone else." My heart quickened. "Would you be willing to testify?" She nodded firmly. "Thomas was like family to me. I won't let them distort who he was or what he wanted." As the case progressed, so did the pressure tactics outside the courtroom. I began receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, silent at first, then escalating to veiled threats. "Drop the case if you know what's good for you," a distorted voice warned before hanging up. One morning, I walked out to find my car vandalized in my driveway, deep scratches running the length of both sides. Another day, I received an envelope containing photographs of me entering and leaving my home, my office, the courthouse proof I was being watched. I reported these incidents to the police, but without evidence connecting them to my father, little could be done. Williams suggested hiring security, which further strained my already stretched resources. The stress took its toll. I lost weight, struggled to sleep, jumped at unexpected sounds. Some days I considered giving up, accepting whatever settlement my father might offer just to end the nightmare. But then I would remember my grandfather's voice. "Stand your ground when you know you're right, Luther. Some fights are worth having." Just when things seemed bleakest, I made a discovery that would change everything. As the legal battle entered its second month, the courtroom dynamics grew increasingly hostile. Judge Harris had dropped all pretense of impartiality, frequently interrupting Williams mid-argument while giving my father's attorney, Richard Donovan, free rein to present his case however he pleased. During one particularly contentious hearing, my father took the stand to testify about his relationship with my grandfather. Under Donovan's gentle questioning, he spun a tale of family misunderstandings and his repeated attempts at reconciliation that my grandfather had allegedly rebuffed due to my influence. "I tried so many times to heal our relationship," my father claimed, his voice catching in a well-rehearsed display of emotion. "But every time I reached out, Thomas seemed poisoned against me." After Luther came into the picture, it only got worse. From my seat at the defense table, I watched in disbelief as Judge Harris nodded sympathetically. The narrative was so contrary to reality that it would have been laughable if it weren't so effective. My father, the man who had walked away from his family without a backward glance, was recasting himself as the victim of circumstances and manipulation. When it was Williams' turn to cross-examine, Judge Harris limited nearly every line of questioning. "Your Honor," Williams protested after his fifth question was interrupted, "the witness has made claims about his relationship with the deceased that go to the heart of this case. We have the right to examine those claims." "You've made your point, Counselor," Harris replied dismissively. "Move along." During a break in proceedings, Williams pulled me into an empty conference room, his expression grave. "This isn't working," he admitted. "Harris has already decided the outcome. We need to consider our options for appeal." "So, we just give up on this round?" I asked, frustration evident in my voice. "Not give up," Williams clarified, "but recognize that our real fight may come at the appellate level. Meanwhile, we need to gather more compelling evidence than what we have now." Following Williams' advice, I began a more thorough search of my grandfather's home office, looking for anything that might help our case. I went through filing cabinets, desk drawers, and storage boxes, most of which contained business documents related to Blackwood construction. On the third day of searching, I found something unusual hidden behind a row of books on the shelf, a false panel that, when removed, revealed a small wall safe I hadn't known existed. It was locked, with no key in sight. After trying several combinations that might have meaning to my grandfather, his birthday. My birthday. The year he founded the company, I remembered something he once told me. "The most important date in my life wasn't when I was born, Luther. It was the day I married your grandmother. That's when my real life began." I tried their wedding anniversary, June 9, 1962, and the safe clicked open. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a USB drive labeled Adam. With trembling hands, I opened the journal to find my grandfather's distinctive handwriting filling page after page. It was a record he had kept for years, documenting his thoughts, business decisions, and family matters. As I began to read, I discovered entries dating back to when my father was a young man working in the family business, before I was even born. The journal revealed a troubled history I had never fully understood. "Adam took $20,000 from the company account today," read an entry from 1991. When confronted, he claimed it was a loan he intended to repay. This is the third such loan this year. I covered the shortage myself rather than involve the authorities, but I cannot continue to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Another entry, from around the time my parents divorced. Adam announced he's leaving Jessica and the boy. Claims family life is stifling him. I suspect there's another woman involved. Offered him counseling, which he refused. My heart breaks for little Luther. 5 years old is too young to understand why his father doesn't want him anymore. The journal continued through the years, documenting my father's sporadic appearances, always coinciding with financial troubles and requests for money. My grandfather had recorded each request, along with his growing conviction that my father suffered from a gambling addiction he refused to acknowledge. Adam came by the office again today, read an entry from just 2 years ago. Another business opportunity, requiring immediate investment. When I declined, he became verbally abusive, threatening to contest my will if I didn't do right by him. I reminded him that he hasn't been a son to me in decades. He stormed out, saying I'd regret choosing Luther over my own flesh and blood. The final entries were from the months before his death, as he contemplated his legacy. Met with Jackson today to finalize my will. I'm leaving everything to Luther, not because he's perfect, the boy has his flaws like anyone, but because he has shown character, responsibility, and genuine care. Adam will be angry, but giving him access to substantial funds would only feed his self-destruction. Sometimes love means saying no. I sat back in my grandfather's chair, overwhelmed by what I'd discovered. The journal provided context for so much that had happened, confirming my suspicions about my father's motivations while revealing a deeper history of conflict I hadn't fully understood. The USB drive contained something even more damning: scanned copies of checks my grandfather had written to my father over the years, each for loan repayment or business investment, totaling well over $1 million. There were also recorded phone conversations where my father had demanded money, becoming increasingly threatening when refused. I immediately called Williams and arranged to meet him at his office that evening. The elderly attorney listened intently as I explained what I'd found, his expression shifting from interest to excitement as he realized the implications. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, carefully examining the journal. Thomas essentially created a record specifically anticipating this situation. The documentation of your father's gambling, the financial demands, the threats, it all establishes a pattern that directly contradicts his testimony. "Will Judge Harris allow it as evidence?" I asked. Williams' expression sobered. "That's the challenge. He'll try to exclude it, claiming it's hearsay or irrelevant. But an appeals court would almost certainly see it differently. At minimum, it gives us leverage." News of our discovery somehow leaked to my father. The very next evening, as I was returning home from a meeting with Williams, I found him waiting on my porch, his expensive car parked in my driveway. "We need to talk," he said, rising from the porch swing as I approached. "I have nothing to say to you," I replied, keeping my distance. "I know you found Thomas's journal," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Whatever garbage he wrote about me, it's one-sided and taken out of context. I studied him, this man who shared my DNA but was otherwise a stranger." "How did you know about the journal?" He ignored the question. "Be smart, Luther. That journal doesn't prove anything except that an old man was bitter and paranoid in his final years. Hand it over, agree to a reasonable settlement, and we can both move on with our lives." "A reasonable settlement?" I repeated incredulously. "You mean where you take what isn't yours, what you didn't earn, what you have no right to?" His facade of civility cracked. "I have every right. He was my father. That money, that company, it should have been mine all along." "It wasn't yours because he knew you'd destroy it," I said quietly. "Just like you've destroyed everything else in your life." His face contorted with rage. "You think you're so much better than me? You're nothing. A nobody who got lucky because an old man felt guilty about his real son. I've got Harris in my pocket. One call from me, and he'll make sure you never see a penny of that inheritance." The admission was so blatant that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. "Did you just admit to having the judge in your pocket?" Realizing his mistake, my father backpedaled, figure of speech. "What I meant was—" "I know exactly what you meant," I interrupted. "And now, so do I." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen to stop the recording app I'd activated when I first spotted him on my porch. His eyes widened as he understood what I'd done. "You can't use that," he sputtered. "It's illegal to record someone without their consent." "Massachusetts is a one-party consent state," I informed him, silently thanking Williams for that particular piece of legal advice. "As long as one person in the conversation consents to the recording, it's perfectly legal, and I definitely consent." He lunged toward me, reaching for the phone, but I stepped back quickly. "Touch me, and we'll add assault to the list of problems you've created for yourself." For a tense moment, we stood facing each other, the air charged with decades of resentment and hurt. Then, without another word, my father turned and stormed to his car, peeling out of my driveway with a screech of tires. I stood watching until his taillights disappeared, the phone still clutched in my hand, containing what might be our key to victory. The morning after my confrontation with my father, I met with Williams at his office, playing him the recording of our conversation. The elderly attorney listened intently, his bushy eyebrows rising when he heard my father's admission about having Judge Harris in his pocket. "This is significant," Williams said when the recording ended. "Combined with the journal and financial records, we now have compelling evidence not just for our case, but potentially for a judicial misconduct investigation." "So what's our next move?" I asked, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Williams tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his desktop. "We need to be strategic. If we present this evidence directly to Harris, he'll find a way to exclude it. We need to get it on the record in a way that he can't easily dismiss." We spent the next several days developing our approach, while I continued exploring the contents of my grandfather's journal more thoroughly. The picture it painted of my father grew increasingly troubling with each page. One entry from the late 90s described a confrontation between them after my father had embezzled company funds to cover gambling debts. Adam showed no remorse when confronted, only anger at being caught. He said, "If you'd paid me what I'm worth, I wouldn't have had to take it. I could have pressed charges, perhaps should have. Instead, I fired him, but kept it quiet to protect the family name. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake. Sheltering him from consequences has only enabled his worst tendencies." Another entry, from around the time I started my renovation business, revealed how my father had approached my grandfather behind my back. "Adam came by today, furious that I helped Luther start his business. Said I never supported his ventures the same way, conveniently forgetting the 3 failed businesses I financed for him in the 90s, all of which collapsed due to his mismanagement. The difference is clear to everyone but him. Luther works 14-hour days building something real, while Adam chases get-rich-quick schemes between trips to Atlantic City." The most disturbing entries detailed escalating threats as my grandfather's health declined. "Adam visited unexpectedly today. Didn't even ask about my health, just launched into his usual demands. When I refused, he said, 'You're not going to live forever, old man. One way or another, I'll get what's mine.' The threat was thinly veiled. I've updated my security system and informed my lawyer of these concerns." Attached to that entry was a photocopy of a restraining order my grandfather had briefly taken out against my father 3 years earlier, something I had never known about. The order had eventually expired without being renewed, but its existence spoke volumes. The USB drive contained even more damning evidence, emails between my father and various creditors, showing debts far larger than I had imagined. There were also communications with online gambling sites, confirmation of wire transfers to casinos, and most alarmingly, a series of exchanges with Judge Harris that predated my grandfather's death. These messages, while carefully worded, made it clear that my father and Harris had discussed my grandfather's estate before he had even passed away. One email from Harris read, "As discussed on the golf course, when the time comes, I'll make sure things proceed accordingly. You can count on me, Adam." As Williams and I reviewed this mountain of evidence, Patricia Donaldson, my grandfather's former assistant, continued providing valuable context and additional documentation. She revealed that my father had called the office multiple times in my grandfather's final months, becoming increasingly aggressive when told Thomas wouldn't speak with him. The last time he called was about 2 weeks before Thomas passed, Patricia recalled during one of our strategy sessions. He said, and I quote, "Tell the old man he better fix his will if he knows what's good for him." I reported it to Thomas, who just shook his head and said, "Add it to the file." That file, we now realized, was the collection of evidence my grandfather had been methodically gathering, perhaps anticipating exactly the situation we now faced. Armed with this comprehensive documentation, Williams filed several motions. One to introduce the new evidence, one requesting Judge Harris recuse himself due to conflict of interest, and a third asking for a hearing before a different judge to review allegations of judicial misconduct. As expected, Harris promptly denied all 3 motions, claiming the evidence was irrelevant and potentially fabricated, while dismissing the conflict of interest allegations as baseless attacks on the court's integrity. What Harris didn't know was that Williams had simultaneously filed complaints with the state's Judicial Conduct Commission and the Bar Association, attaching copies of all our evidence. We had also leaked selected portions of the evidence, nothing that would compromise the case, to an investigative reporter at the Boston Globe who had previously covered judicial corruption cases. My father, somehow learning of these maneuvers, escalated his harassment campaign. The anonymous calls increased, now featuring explicit threats rather than vague warnings. My office was broken into, though nothing of value was taken, a clear intimidation tactic. One morning I discovered all 4 tires on my car had been slashed. When none of this deterred me, my father resorted to direct confrontation again. This time he appeared at my workplace in the middle of the day, barging into a client meeting. "We need to talk." "Now," he demanded, ignoring the startled clients. I excused myself and led him to a private office, making sure to leave the door open. "Say what you came to say, then leave." "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Drop the complaints against Harris, hand over the journal and that recording, or things will get much worse for you." "Are you threatening me?" I asked calmly, aware that my employees could hear us from the hallway. "I'm giving you one last chance," he replied. "You have no idea who you're dealing with or what I'm capable of." "Actually, I think I do," I said. "Thanks to Grandfather's journal and our previous conversation, I have a pretty clear picture. Now, I have clients waiting." As he turned to leave, he delivered a final warning. "Final hearing is in 3 days. Fix this before then, or you'll regret it for the rest of your life." After he left, I called Williams to update him. The attorney sounded worried. "Be careful, Luther. A desperate man is a dangerous one, and your father has a lot to lose here." "So do I reminded him. "Grandfather's legacy, his company, the livelihoods of dozens of employees. It's all at stake." "Just promise me you'll take precautions," Williams insisted. "Stay with a friend if possible, vary your routine, keep your phone handy." I agreed, but privately, I was tired of being on the defensive. It was time to take control of this situation once and for all. That night, I carefully reviewed everything we had gathered: the journal, financial records, emails, the recording of my father admitting to having Harris in his pocket, and Patricia's testimony. Individually, each piece was compelling. Together, they told an undeniable story of manipulation, greed, and corruption. The final hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. By Wednesday evening, our preparations were complete, our strategy set. Williams had subpoenaed several surprise witnesses, including former employees of my father who had knowledge of his financial misconduct, and a court clerk who had overheard conversations between my father and Judge Harris outside the courtroom. Most importantly, we had prepared a detailed motion for immediate mistrial based on judicial misconduct, with copies ready to be submitted to the appeals court the moment Harris inevitably denied it. "We've done everything possible to prepare," Williams assured me during our final strategy session. "Now we just need to get it all on the record, in a way that can't be ignored, even by a biased judge." That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my grandfather's study, now truly mine, in a way it hadn't been before. I had spent weeks immersed in his private thoughts through his journal, coming to understand him not just as my beloved grandfather, but as a man who had faced his own struggles and made difficult choices. In one of the final journal entries, written just weeks before his death, he had written, "I worry about the burden I'm placing on Luther's shoulders. Not just the company, but the conflict that will inevitably come from Adam. But I've watched Luther grow into a man of principle. He won't be bullied or bought. That gives me peace as I feel my time growing short." Reading those words again, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just about money or property, it was about honoring a legacy of integrity. My grandfather had stood his ground against my father's manipulation for decades. Now it was my turn. As dawn broke on the day of the final hearing, I felt strangely calm. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I knew we had truth on our side. And sometimes, as Williams had said weeks earlier, that was enough. The courtroom was packed for the final hearing. Word had spread about the contentious case involving Blackwood Construction, and many industry people had come to witness the outcome. Local media were present as well, including the Boston Globe reporter who had been investigating the relationship between my father and Judge Harris. I sat at the defense table beside Williams, who looked remarkably composed despite the stakes. Across the aisle, my father and his attorney Richard Donovan huddled in whispered consultation. My father wore an expensive charcoal suit and a confident smile that suggested he still believed victory was assured. Judge Harris entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. Harris surveyed the crowded room with obvious displeasure before taking his seat. "Before we begin," Harris announced, "I want to make it clear that this court will not tolerate any further unfounded accusations against its integrity. The motions filed by the defense attacking this court have been denied and stricken from the record. Is that understood?" Williams rose calmly. "Your Honor, we respectfully maintain that our motions were properly filed based on substantial evidence, and we reserve all rights to appeal their denial." Harris glared at him. "Noted, Counselor. Now, let's proceed. This is the final hearing regarding the contested will of Thomas Blackwood. Mr. Donovan, call your first witness." "The plaintiff calls Adam Reeves," Donovan announced. My father took the stand with practiced confidence, smoothing his tie as he settled into the witness chair. After being sworn in, he began telling his carefully crafted narrative under Donovan's gentle questioning. "Thomas Blackwood was my father," he began, his voice catching slightly. "Despite our differences over the years, there was always a bond between us. Blood ties don't just disappear." He described a fictional history where he had repeatedly attempted to reconcile with my grandfather, only to be rebuffed due to my grandfather's irrational grudges, and later, my manipulative influence. In his final years, Thomas wasn't himself, my father claimed, shaking his head sorrowfully. His health was failing, and he became increasingly paranoid and confused. Luther took advantage of that vulnerability, isolating my father from the rest of his family and poisoning him against us. As my father's testimony continued, Judge Harris nodded along sympathetically, occasionally glancing toward me with barely concealed contempt. The climax of my father's performance came when Donovan asked about his feelings regarding the will. "It's not about the money," my father insisted, though everyone in the room knew otherwise. "It's about recognizing what's right. I spent decades trying to rebuild our relationship, only to have everything I worked for stolen away." Rising from his seat, my father dramatically pointed at me across the courtroom. "This boy only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve. He hasn't earned any of it, not the company my father built, not the fortune he accumulated through a lifetime of hard work. All of that should remain in the true family line, not handed to someone who just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Judge Harris nodded in agreement, while Donovan smiled smugly at Williams. From their expressions, they clearly believed they'd won. "No further questions, Your Honor," Donovan concluded, looking pleased with my father's performance. "Cross-examination?" Harris asked Williams, with the air of someone fulfilling a tedious obligation. "Yes, Your Honor," Williams replied, rising slowly. Despite his 70-plus years, he suddenly seemed energized as he approached the witness stand. "Mr. Reeves," he began, "you testified that you made numerous attempts to reconcile with your father over the years. Could you provide specific dates and details of these attempts?" My father shifted uncomfortably. "I can't recall exact dates. It happened many times over many years." "Indeed," Williams replied. "Yet in Thomas Blackwood's detailed daily planners, which we have here from the past 15 years, your name appears exactly 7 times. Each entry coincides with what he described as requests for money, no holidays, no birthdays, no casual visits, just requests for funds. How do you explain that?" "He obviously didn't record everything," my father responded dismissively. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Let's talk about your financial situation, Mr. Reeves. Are you currently facing significant debt?" "Objection," Donovan interrupted. "Irrelevant to the validity of the will." "Your Honor," Williams countered, "the plaintiff's financial motivation is directly relevant to his credibility and motive in contesting this will." Harris looked annoyed but reluctantly said, "I'll allow it, but keep it brief." Williams turned back to my father. "Mr. Reeves, isn't it true that you owe approximately $2 million to various creditors, including several $100,000 to a casino in Atlantic City?" My father's face flushed. "My personal finances are not relevant here. They become relevant," Williams pressed, "when they establish a compelling motive for contesting a will against the clearly expressed wishes of the deceased. Isn't it true that you approached Thomas Blackwood just 3 months before his death, demanding money to cover gambling debts?" "Objection," Donovan shouted again. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Harris said immediately. "Move on, Counselor." Williams appeared unperturbed. Mr. Reeves, you claim that my client isolated your father in his final years. Are you aware that Thomas Blackwood maintained active friendships with dozens of people until his death, attended weekly community events, and hosted regular gatherings at his home, all of which Luther helped facilitate? Before my father could respond, Williams continued, "And are you aware that we have affidavits from 27 of Thomas's friends and associates stating that you were never present at any of these events, despite standing invitations?" "Objection!" Donovan called out again. "Counsel is testifying rather than questioning." "Sustained," Harris ruled. "Mr. Williams, this court has already ruled on the admissibility of those affidavits. Do not reference excluded evidence." Williams nodded respectfully. "My apologies, Your Honor." But the point had been made for the benefit of the packed courtroom and the media present. Turning back to my father, Williams shifted tactics. "Mr. Reeves, how often did you speak with Judge Harris about this case outside of this courtroom?" The question landed like a bomb. My father's expression froze, while Judge Harris's head snapped up in alarm. "Objection!" Donovan nearly shouted. "That question is outrageous and assumes facts not in evidence." "Your Honor," Williams replied calmly, "I have documentary evidence of communications between the plaintiff and Your Honor regarding this case that occurred prior to these proceedings. I believe this constitutes an undisclosed conflict of interest that fundamentally compromises the court's impartiality." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Harris banged his gavel repeatedly, his face flushing deep red. "That's enough, Counselor. Approach the bench immediately." As the attorneys gathered before the judge, I could see an intense exchange taking place, with Harris gesturing angrily while Williams remained composed, occasionally nodding toward a thick folder he carried. After several tense minutes, they returned to their places. Harris, now visibly unsettled, announced, "This court will take a 15-minute recess." He quickly retreated to his chambers. During the break, Williams explained what had happened. I showed him some of what we have, the emails, the recorded conversations. He knows we're prepared to submit it all to the Judicial Conduct Commission if he doesn't recuse himself. "Will he?" I asked. Williams looked uncertain. "He's between a rock and a hard place now. If he recuses himself, it's an implicit admission of impropriety. If he doesn't, we'll file our evidence publicly." When court reconvened, Harris looked noticeably paler but seemed determined to maintain control. "We will continue with cross-examination," he announced tersely. Williams returned to the podium. "Mr. Reeves, I'd like to discuss Thomas Blackwood's journal, which he maintained for over 30 years. "Objection," Donovan interrupted. "The alleged journal was not properly authenticated and contains hearsay." "Your Honor," Williams countered, "the journal has been authenticated by a handwriting expert and as a diary kept in the regular course of Mr. Blackwood's life. It qualifies as an exception to the hearsay rule under the business records exception." Harris hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining his bias toward my father and avoiding further evidence of judicial misconduct. Finally, he said grudgingly, "I'll allow limited questioning about the journal." Williams nodded and turned back to my father. "Mr. Reeves, Thomas Blackwood's journal contains detailed accounts of funds he provided to you over the years, loans that were never repaid, failed business ventures he financed, and gambling debts he covered. The total exceeds $1 million. Would you like to explain this history of financial support that you never mentioned in your testimony?" My father's confident facade finally cracked. "That journal is full of lies," he snapped. Thomas was bitter and vindictive in his old age. And yet, Williams continued, "the journal entries are corroborated by bank records, canceled checks, and business documents spanning 3 decades. It also documents your threats when he refused to provide additional funds in recent years. Would you characterize those as lies as well?" "This is a setup," my father sputtered, looking desperately toward Judge Harris for intervention. Williams pressed on. "Mr. Reeves, the journal also references a restraining order Thomas Blackwood took out against you 3 years ago after you threatened him. Is that also a fabrication?" Before my father could answer, Donovan jumped up. "Your Honor, I move that this entire line of questioning be stricken from the record. Counsel is clearly attempting to prejudice the court with unsubstantiated allegations." Harris seemed uncertain how to proceed. The courtroom was completely silent, all eyes on him. Finally he said, "The motion is granted. The jury will disregard," he caught himself, realizing there was no jury in this probate case. "This line of questioning will cease." Williams nodded and changed direction. "Mr. Reeves, one final question. Do you recall a conversation you had with Luther Blackwood on his porch approximately 2 weeks ago?" My father's expression flickered with alarm. "We spoke briefly. I don't recall the details." "Allow me to refresh your memory," Williams said, reaching into his briefcase. "Would it surprise you to learn that Luther recorded that conversation, as is legal in Massachusetts with one-party consent?" The color drained from my father's face. "You can't." In that recording, Williams continued, "You stated, and I quote, 'I've got Harris in my pocket. One call from me, and he'll make sure you never see a penny of that inheritance.' End quote. Would you care to explain what you meant by having Judge Harris in your pocket?" The courtroom erupted again. Judge Harris slammed his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. When the noise finally subsided, Harris glared at Williams. "Counselor, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt." "With respect, Your Honor," Williams replied evenly, "I'm simply pursuing relevant evidence regarding the plaintiff's credibility and potential collusion to subvert these proceedings." Harris turned to my father. "The witness will answer the question." My father, now visibly sweating, stammered, "It was just a figure of speech. I didn't mean anything by it." "A figure of speech," Williams repeated skeptically. "And would you characterize the emails between yourself and Judge Harris discussing this case before it was even filed also as figures of speech?" Complete chaos broke out in the courtroom. Donovan was on his feet shouting objections, reporters were scribbling furiously, and spectators were exchanging shocked looks. Judge Harris pounded his gavel so hard the head broke off, clattering across his bench. "This court is in recess," Harris shouted above the din. "We will reconvene in 1 hour." As the judge stormed out, my father lunged toward me, his face contorted with rage. "You'll pay for this," he hissed before court officers stepped between us. During the recess, Williams received a call from the chief judge of the probate court, who had been alerted to the situation unfolding in Harris's courtroom. After a brief conversation, Williams returned to me with a hint of a smile. "Judge Harris has recused himself," he announced. "The case will be reassigned to Judge Maria Sanchez. She's known for her fairness and strict ethical standards." "What about my father?" I asked. Williams's expression sobered. "He's currently meeting with his attorney. I suspect Donovan is explaining the potential criminal implications of what's been revealed today." When court reconvened an hour later, Judge Sanchez presided. Her first action was to announce, "In light of the serious allegations raised today, this court will review all evidence previously excluded by Judge Harris. We will reconvene tomorrow morning for a full hearing." As we prepared to leave, I saw my father in deep conversation with Donovan, both looking grim. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth was finally emerging, and with it, the chance for justice to prevail. That evening, as Williams and I reviewed our strategy for the following day, my phone rang. It was Donovan. "My client would like to discuss a settlement," he said without preamble. "We're not interested," I replied firmly. "Hear me out," Donovan insisted. "Adam is prepared to drop all claims to the estate and company. In exchange, he asks only that you withdraw any allegations of judicial misconduct and agree not to pursue criminal charges." I considered this briefly. "Tell him I'll think about it." After ending the call, I turned to Williams. "What do you think?" The elderly attorney shook his head. "That's your decision, Luther. Legally, you're in a strong position now. The new judge will almost certainly rule in your favor based on the evidence. As for the criminal implications, that's between your father and the authorities." I spent a restless night weighing my options. By morning, I had my answer. When we returned to court, Judge Sanchez asked if there were any preliminary matters to address. Donovan rose. "Your Honor, the parties have been discussing a potential resolution." "Is that so?" Sanchez asked, turning to Williams. "My client has considered the plaintiff's offer," Williams replied. "He has a counterproposal." All eyes turned to me as I stood. "Your Honor, I'm prepared to withdraw any criminal allegations against my father on one condition that he agree to attend gambling addiction treatment and financial counseling." My father looked stunned by this unexpected response. Judge Sanchez nodded thoughtfully. "I take it, this means the will contest would be withdrawn?" "Yes, Your Honor," Donovan confirmed after a quick consultation with my father. Very well, Sanchez replied. Prepare the necessary stipulations, and we'll formalize this agreement. As the courtroom cleared, my father approached me cautiously. Why? He asked simply. Because grandfather would have wanted me to be better than this, I replied. Not better than you, better than this whole situation. He spent his life building things, not tearing them down. My father nodded slowly, unable to meet my eyes. I won't thank you. I don't expect you to, I said. Just get the help you need. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving behind the bitterness that had threatened to consume me throughout this ordeal. I had honored my grandfather's legacy, not just by protecting his final wishes, but by showing the integrity he had valued above all else. As Williams and I left the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements about the dramatic conclusion to the case. No comment, Williams told them firmly. This was a private family matter that has been resolved privately. I smiled at that description, knowing how public and messy the whole affair had actually been. But perhaps this was the best way to start healing by reclaiming the privacy and dignity that both my grandfather and I deserved. In the months following the courtroom showdown, life gradually returned to a new normal. Judge Harris resigned from the bench rather than face a formal investigation, while my father, true to his word, enrolled in a treatment program for gambling addiction. I kept my distance, respecting the fragility of his recovery process while remaining open to the possibility of a healthier relationship in the distant future. Blackwood Construction continued to thrive under my leadership, though the transition wasn't without challenges. Many of the longtime employees had initially been skeptical of me, a young man with limited experience in large-scale commercial construction, suddenly in charge of a multi-million-dollar operation. I didn't blame them for their concerns. I know I have big shoes to fill, I told the staff during my first company-wide meeting. I'm not Thomas Blackwood, and I won't pretend to be, but I share his values, integrity, quality, and treating people right. I'm here to learn from you as much as to lead. This humble approach gradually won over the skeptics. I spent time in every department, learning the business from the ground up while bringing fresh perspectives where appropriate. Some of my ideas failed spectacularly, but the occasional success earned me grudging respect. 6 months after gaining full control of my inheritance, I established the Thomas Blackwood Foundation, dedicating $1 million to support vocational training and apprenticeship programs in the construction trades. The foundation also created a scholarship fund for children of Blackwood construction employees, ensuring that education would be accessible regardless of financial circumstances. Your grandfather would be proud, Williams told me at the foundation's launch event. The elderly attorney had become something of a mentor to me, filling yet another void left by my father's absence. Not just of what you're doing with the money, but how you've handled yourself through all this. I'm not sure about that, I admitted. Sometimes I think I was too harsh with my father. Williams shook his head. You set a boundary and offered help without enabling. Thomas struggled with that balance his entire life with Adam. You found it immediately. My personal renovation business had suffered during the legal battle, but I decided not to abandon it entirely. Instead, I scaled it back to focus on select historic preservation projects, the work I was most passionate about. This arrangement allowed me to maintain my independence while devoting necessary attention to Blackwood Construction. The most unexpected development came 3 months after the court case concluded, when I received an email from my half-sister, Eliza. At 22, she was the older of my father's 2 children from his second marriage. We had met only a handful of times throughout our lives, always in stilted, uncomfortable family gatherings. I know this is weird, her message began, but I was hoping we could meet sometime. Dad's been different since he started treatment, more present, more honest. He told us about everything that happened with grandfather and the inheritance. I don't expect us to become best friends overnight, but maybe it's time to at least know each other as adults. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, both clearly nervous about bridging the family divide. Eliza looked more like our father than I did, with the same angular features and calculating eyes, though hers held a warmth his had always lacked. Thanks for agreeing to this, she said as we settled with our drinks. I've been thinking about reaching out for years, but it never seemed like the right time. What changed? I asked. She considered the question carefully. Watching Dad fall apart and then slowly start putting himself back together, I guess. It made me realize how fragile family connections are and how easily they can be lost. I don't want to wake up 20 years from now wondering about the brother I never really knew. That initial meeting led to others, and gradually to a cautious friendship. Eventually, I met my younger half-brother Justin as well. At 19, he was still finding his way in the world, unsure of his path but eager to establish his own identity separate from our father's shadow. "He talks about you sometimes," Justin told me during one of our get-togethers. "Not much, but when he does, there's a respect there that wasn't before." I took this information with cautious optimism. The wounds created by decades of my father's absence and recent betrayal were too deep to heal quickly, if ever. But I had learned from my grandfather's journal that holding on to bitterness only perpetuates the cycle of pain. 1 year to the day after the court case concluded, I visited my grandfather's grave, bringing fresh flowers and taking a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The polished granite headstone was simple but elegant, just as he would have wanted. "I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me all those years," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish talking to a headstone. It wasn't just about business or money or even family. It was about standing firm in your values while remaining open to growth. About recognizing that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most important destinations. As I stood there, memories washed over me, my grandfather teaching me to tie my shoes when my small fingers couldn't manage the laces, his patient guidance as I struggled with high school algebra, his unwavering support when I put college on hold to care for my mother, his pride when I landed my first renovation contract. The inheritance he left me wasn't primarily about money or property. It was this legacy of integrity, resilience, and genuine care for others. Those were the true valuables that no court could ever award or take away. Walking back to my car, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since his death. The legal battle was behind me, the company was thriving, and new family connections were cautiously forming. There would be challenges ahead, certainly, but I faced them with the foundation my grandfather had helped me build. The greatest lesson from this ordeal wasn't about winning or losing, but about choosing what kind of person I wanted to be when faced with adversity. My father had chosen bitterness and entitlement. My grandfather had chosen integrity and generosity, even when it was difficult. I hoped I was following the better example. Life rarely gives us clear villains and heroes, I've come to realize. My father wasn't purely evil, just deeply flawed and unwilling to acknowledge his weaknesses until forced to do so. My grandfather wasn't perfect either. His journal revealed regrets about how he had handled various situations, including his relationship with my father. And me? I'm still learning, still growing, still trying to honor a legacy while creating my own. Some days are easier than others, some decisions clearer than most. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for what's right meant risking everything? Or where forgiving someone seemed impossible until you realized that forgiveness was for your peace, not theirs? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life experiences. Your support means everything as I continue sharing these difficult but important moments from my journey. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most important inheritance isn't what's in the bank, but what's in your heart.